Good afternoon. Today, I'd like to talk to you about a phenomenon which occurred just before the outbreak of the Second World War called the Kindertransport. Now, Kinder means children in Germany, transport means transport. And this was a remarkable event or series of events which took place during the beginning of one of the darkest periods in human history, the build-up in Nazi Germany and in the German occupied territories to what we now call the Holocaust, the Shoah and the Holocaust, the mass murder of European Jewish citizens, perhaps to the total of 5.7 million before the end of the war in 1945. Before we look at the Kindertransport, we need to consider the context, the background, what actually happened, how it was that it was necessary to move large numbers of children from their homes, from their parents in Europe, to the security and sanctuary of Britain. What we now call anti-Semitism, a hatred of Jews, has a long and unfortunate pedigree in Europe. In the Middle Ages, in the late 13th century, England had its own Holocaust. All of the Jewish citizens in England were expelled by King Edward I. Many were murdered. There was a huge mass killing of Jewish citizens in York in 1190. And for several centuries, there were no Jewish people in England. They were invited back by Oliver Cromwell after the end of the First Civil War around 1650, because he needed Jewish capital and Jewish entrepreneurial flair to kickstart a Civil War damaged economy. Now this, what we now call anti-Semitism, at that time was anti-Judaism. What was abhorrent to Christians was the faith of the Jew. As a Jewish individual, you could save yourself from persecution by abjuring your faith and converting to Christianity. Your religion was the main bone of contention. However, in the 19th century, a new, rather perverse science called eugenics began to divide people into racial types, racial stereotypes, as we now call them. And this perverted science declared that if you were, that being Jewish wasn't just about practicing Judaism, it was an actual ethnic condition. You were born a Jew, a Semite. And therefore, if anyone was anti-Semitic, they objected to the very fact of your existence. Changing your religion wouldn't help. Now, this rabid anti-Semitism began to develop in Germany after the end of the First World War in 1918. A myth was put about by General Ludendorff and others who were upset, shall we say, at losing and couldn't accept the fact that Britain and France had beaten them. They came to a conclusion, or a perverse conclusion, that they hadn't been defeated in the field, although they had, and that what had actually happened was a stab in the back, that a cabal of German Jewish bankers had conspired against the Kaiser and his Germany, had thrown in their lot and all of their capital with the Allies, which effectively had enabled the Allies to buy a victory in 1918. This is complete nonsense, of course. The Germans had been beaten, had been defeated militarily, been crushed. But that was just too much of a bitter pill to swallow. And this stab in the back theory, the idea that it was the Jews who were responsible, really took hold. It ignored the fact that 100,000 adult male German Jews had fought for the Kaiser in the First World War, and 12,000 of them had been killed. Many Jews, when the anti-Jewish riots started, particularly in the 30s after Hitler came to power, would demonstrate wearing the medals they had worn, also had won during the First World War. And Frank's father, Otto Frank, actually had a higher classification of the Iron Cross than did Adolf Hitler. Hitler was not an innovator. He had no idea about innovation. He simply picked up on trends and exploited them. His anti-Semitism, which may have derived from his days as a pretty useless painter in Vienna when he blamed the Jewish art cabal there from denying him due prominence, was certainly fueled by the mood of the post-war period and fueled again by the economic recession and desperate levels of inflation which Germany experienced as a result of the crushing pressures of the peace treaty, Treaty of Versailles. As Hitler began to gain more followers, when he penned his great masterpiece Mein Kampf in 1923, he made anti-Semitism one of the core pillars of his philosophy. He regarded communists and Jews as two sides of the same coin. So war on Jews was a war on communists, both his national enemies. He declared quite openly his objective was to remove all Jews from Germany. Now, initially, this didn't mean murder. This meant effectively encouraging Jewish people to move away and leave Germany. There were about 500,000 German Jews in 1933, most of whom were secularized. They were not necessarily particularly Orthodox, some Orthodox, of course, but most of them, and fully integrated into German life, into work, into the professions. But by 1935, Hitler had passed the Nuremberg laws, and the Nuremberg laws were racial laws. They were racial superiority laws. They declared that Jews were second-class citizens, very much second class. They were barred from serving in the judiciary, from holding public office, from practicing as doctors, lawyers, all of the professions in which they had previously been engaged. They were not allowed to sit on certain park benches. They were not allowed to sit on certain seats in the trams and buses. Jewish children could not be educated in mainstream state education. So this was the beginning of a wake-up call for the Jews of Germany. And yet what a painful call that was. How difficult to comprehend. Because German Jews regard themselves primarily as Germans. The fact of their faith was a secondary matter. But gradually, bit by bit, they began to realize that they were being pushed out of public life. And Hitler's objective was to have the whole of Germany Judenfrei, free of Jews. The real wake-up call, this clarion to the horror that was about to follow, occurred on the 10th of November 1938. Kristallnacht, Night of Broken Glass, when mobs of the SS and SA ran amok through the streets, destroying Jewish businesses, attacking Jewish citizens, murdering them, burning down synagogues and any other building identified with Jewish interest. It was a horrific incident, and nothing could have blazoned Hitler's manifesto across the skies more effectively than that. As a result, groups of humanitarians, Jewish organizations, but also general humanitarian organizations, Quakers organizations, realized that the horror would not go away. And 5 days after Kristallnacht, on the 15th of November, Jewish groups and Quakers in England, Britain, came together and decided to put together a scheme allowing or to permit refugee Jewish children, primarily Jewish children, from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, which any day now is going to be occupied by Germany, to allow those children to come into Britain and be fostered and be looked after here and be safe. They had an ally in Sir Samuel Hoare, the Home Secretary, who listened attentively to their proposals and was instrumental in guiding approval through Parliament when the matter was debated later in November. Chamberlain, Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, who's often, who might have been thought of indecisive, of course, was blamed for the disaster at Munich, he was nonetheless sympathetic. The British political establishment was sympathetic. And it was agreed initially the number of Jewish children would be admitted into the country without the normal visa and passport restrictions, unrestricted immigration up to a certain number. Initially, Jewish organizations wanted 5,000 children. That's really between very young up to the age of 17 to be admitted. They also hoped that 10,000 children might be admitted to Palestine, then, which was then controlled by the British on the back of an international mandate. But the British, aware of the very fraught situation in Palestine between Jewish and Arab groups, would not allow further unrestricted immigration into Palestine, and therefore the refugee children's movement, which was the guiding body for the Kindertransport, decided they would try and take 15,000 children out of Europe and into Britain. Now that process began then from the end of November 1938 and went right on until the declaration of war, until, that is to say, until Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, really a period effectively of 9 months, not a long time in which to bring off such a substantial coup in rescuing these children from their homes and potential peril in occupied Europe and bringing them safely to Britain. Of course, in Britain, they had to be rehoused. Foster parents had to be found. The British state was not prepared to accept financial responsibility. The RCM, Refugee Children's Movement, had to prepare to put up £50 for each child to cover their initial expenses in this country and to find foster homes for them. In fact, the last Kindertransport movement actually occurred during the war. The Dutch end of the operation managed to get one last shipload of children out of Holland, even after war had been declared, even after Holland had been invaded on the 10th of May 1940. And the ship finally sailed to Harwich on the 14th of May 1940, day before Holland surrendered. And thereafter, of course, the whole of mainland Europe was effectively closed off and was being run by the Nazis. Hitler and members of his team who were responsible for dealing with Jewish affairs, people like Reinhard Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann, seriously unpleasant characters, were following Hitler's dictum to try and encourage Jews to escape. So the idea of Jewish children leaving Germany did not necessarily find any particular objection from them. Jews were allowed, even encouraged, to emigrate. You could take the tools of the trade, you could take even the equipment from your factory, but you couldn't take money. Your capital had to be left in Germany. And a large part of this anti-Semitism was motivated by greed, to steal money and property from the Jewish citizens by targeting them and making them non-citizens. What we know, what we do know about this, is that these are steps toward genocide. Firstly, you demonize the target. Jews are no longer people. They were vermin. They were rats feeding on the body politic of Germany. They were dehumanized. Once you dehumanize someone, well, it's not a big move to then take physical action against them. Concentration camps in Germany, Konzentrationslager, had been established as soon as the Nazis came to power in 1933. Dachau, not far from Munich, had been one of the first. And initially, these were there to house political dissidents. Anybody who was daft enough or brave enough to object to the Nazi regime was arrested and shipped out to one of these camps, where they were subjected to a regime, an extremely pleasant regime, a short, sharp shock. And it was possible you might be released. It was equally possible you might be murdered. But initially, certainly by 1939, there was no deliberate policy of mass murder towards the Jews. It has to be borne in mind that most of those children who left their parents had those tearful partings from their parents, but never seen them again. Now, transporting children across the continent was no easy matter. The Germans did not want their main ports to be used because they didn't want their ports cluttered up. So the majority of the young people had to be taken from either Germany or Austria or Czechoslovakia, now Czech Republic and Slovakia, and latterly from Poland when the Polish corridor was threatened. Normally by train from their town, their homes, to the coast of Holland, normally to the Hook of Holland, and then taken by ferry, by ship, across to Harwich. And it was early December 1938 when the first group of children, 174, arrived at Harwich. By then, from there, they were taken normally by railway to Liverpool Street Station, which was the kind of nodal point for their dispersal. And many would be able to be placed with families straight away. Others who could not be immediately accommodated had to be put up for a short time, hopefully, in hostels. And it all sounds very objective, it all sounds very easy, but we have to bear in mind the trauma which this involved, the trauma for the children and the trauma for their parents. Most of these children, especially the younger ones, had never been away from home before. And yet they were being literally separated from their parents with no guarantee as to when they might ever see their parents. All they could take with them was one small suitcase of personal possessions, and only the label around their neck with their name and destination written on it. This was, for the parents, of course, it was terrible. This is an act of desperation on their part, trying to get their children out of what they perceived to be harm's way, although they themselves would be staying. But very few of them, of course, at that time realized just the extent of the horror. In 1939, the Germans invaded Poland and encountered a country which had a population of 3 million Jews. And these were not your urbanized and secularized Jews. These were not Orthodox, but certainly quite devout communities living in relatively remote rural locations. And instantly, a process of mass murder and forcible enclosure within sections of cities, ghettos, was set up. Tens of thousands were murdered by the Germans and, it has to be said, by the Russians when they invaded from the east. That horror was exacerbated after the 22nd of June 1941, when Germany extended its great plan for global domination, its campaign of conquest, further into the east with Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia. Now, this was a considerable gamble on Hitler's part. He launched 3 million men against the might and almost unbelievable expanse of Russia. No conqueror had succeeded, and in the day neither did he. But it meant that millions more Russian Jews who'd been concentrated in the east as a result of earlier pogroms were now in the path of the Nazi juggernaut. There were particular groups, Einsatzgruppen, who went around murdering Jews and, of course, political commissars. And these gangs of murderers were symptomatic of the shift in Nazi policy from one of simply forcing the Jews into exile to an active process of mass murder. This process had already begun before Hitler introduced any order in 1941. Various individual German officers and area commanders were experimenting with ways of killing Jews in large numbers using carbon monoxide poisoning, something which they pioneered whilst murdering people with physical or mental illnesses during the T4 program before the war. We don't quite know when Hitler decided that he would kill all of the Jews. Hitler tended not to give direct orders. He threw out ideas and let his sycophants, like dogs, scrabble in the dirt to pick up and tease out from the bone what Hitler actually wanted. Possibly, he gave a general suggestion it would be best just to get rid of the Jews to Goering sometime in the autumn of 1941. By the time of the Wannsee Conference in early 1942, which was the executive beginning or executive management program for the Holocaust, the order had clearly been given. Heydrich, for all his posturing, was not far enough up the management chain to actually originate this on his own authority. This meant that those Jewish children, and predominantly Jewish, who had been moved from Germany to Britain, and also there are other countries involved as well, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Sweden, all took in refugee children. But the Kindertransport program itself really was a British phenomenon in that the British government certainly approved of the program and facilitated it to the extent that visa requirements were suspended. Once war had declared, these young people did not see their parents. One or two groups of parents did manage to escape from Germany before the war, just at the start of the war, but by and large they did not. And of those 10,000 young people who came to this country, very few would ever see their parents or their families ever again. We just need to think about that. At the age of 5 or 6, you've been taken away from your parents, sent to a foreign country with foster parents for what you understand is a temporary arrangement. But you never see your family again. You have no home. You have no family. You have no nation. You have nothing. You are stateless. There's another bitter irony to this. In 1940, Parliament passed legislation, the rather strangely worded Friendly Enemy Aliens Act, to intern enemy aliens. Of course, friendly enemy aliens were those who were thought not to be a threat but would still be interned. Of the 10,000 Jewish young people who had come across, roughly 1,000 were interned, mainly young males approaching adulthood, at the Knockville internment camp on the Isle of Man. This seems like a bitter irony that all those who've been spirited away from Europe to take them to safety and to avoid oppression were now being oppressed. It had to be said that most were released pretty quickly. There was a lot of pressure to release the Kindertransport children, young people, from the internment program. And any who wanted to, of course, were encouraged to sign on with the Allied forces, British forces, once they reached the age of 18. Many did. Many, particularly young men who joined the armed forces, young women who joined nursing and ancillary services. Many did do their bit to defeat Hitler. Some even served in special forces, SAS and other groups. Most had to be given false identities, false dog tags, because the British knew that if you were captured even in uniform as a British Jewish soldier, you might well suffer rather different treatment to a normal POW. One of those who was most active in the movement of the Jewish children was Nicholas Winton. Now, Winton was a stockbroker. He was 29, 1938. He was of Anglo-German parentage, and he was actually on his way to on a skiing holiday in December 1938 when he stopped at Prague to assist a friend who was involved with refugee work. Winton became passionate about assisting with his group and converted his dining table in his suite at the Wenceslas Hotel to a planning center where he planned how many children he could rescue. In fact, he personally was responsible for saving nearly 700 children. Children almost certainly who would have faced death had they been left at the mercy of the Nazis. There were many others, of course. Rabbi Schoenfeld, people almost without name and number who did their bit to help Kindertransport children. And what these people did, what Winton and the other brave individuals who were involved in this work did, was they managed to show a small light of humanity in the face of a growing catastrophe. It took a long time for people to realize that the Nazis intended to murder the entire Jewish population of Europe, even the countries that didn't occupy. By 1942, these ad hoc concentration camps like Belzec and Sobibor were being replaced or upgraded into more professionalized killing centers, the worst of which, of course, was Auschwitz, Birkenau. Perhaps in the whole history of man's inhumanity to man, never has mass murder, mass killing been industrialized to quite such an extent. The complex near the small Polish town of Auschwitz covers nearly 50 square kilometers. Between the time of its construction in 1942, the date it was liberated by the Russians on the 28th of January 1945, over 1 million people, perhaps 1.25 million people, had been murdered in this camp. Systematic, organized, industrialized, mass production murder. Never had such suffering been seen on such a scale. Those who had got to Britain, who had made it to Britain, survived. And not only had they survived, they thrived in many cases. Those who had joined the Kindertransport became valued members of British society. They contributed to industry, to the arts, to the armed services, the cultural life of their adopted country. Now, Gateshead was one of those areas which was particularly affected by the Kindertransport. The idea of refugees, Jewish refugees settling in Gateshead, wasn't a new one. In 1890, Zachariah Bernstone and other Eastern European emigres who arrived in Britain, fleeing from the Russian pogroms, and finding that their brethren on the north side of the town in Newcastle were perhaps rather too lax in their observance, set up their own Orthodox and strict community in Gateshead. And many Kindertransport, certainly those who were more orthodox in their persuasion, joined them. And of course, Gateshead's Talmudical College now is rightly world famous, the largest of its type outside New York and indeed Israel. So this country and our region, Gateshead, provided a sanctuary, a safe haven for young people whose lives were at risk, who, had they been left where they were, would have been murdered, almost certainly. And those people have given back enormously to their community. They have enriched the life of our community. They are part of our community. Their children, their grandchildren, even their great-grandchildren are living here today, and we hope will live for many, many generations in perfect safety here. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the talk tonight. And of course, I'm here for questions and answers. As it happens, I've had 3 questions already put to me. The first of which is, were there people involved in Europe who are acting effectively as agents for the Kindertransport during the time it was operating? The answer is yes. Those who were running the Kindertransport acted through a network of agents in all the various countries. The second question was, were there any covert transports once the war had begun? As far as I'm aware, there weren't, because obviously all the normal means of communication were cut off by the hostilities. But we do know that in the Netherlands, where of course the Netherlands were not invaded by the Germans until the 10th of May 1940, the Dutch representatives managed to get one last boatload of young people away from IJmuiden, from the port of Rotterdam, on the 14th of May, the day before Holland surrendered and the shutters came down all the way across Europe. A third question was, were there any of the Kindertransport who returned home after the end of the war? Now, I can't actually give a definitive answer to that, but I can suggest that probably not that many. If you think about it, those who had come over here as children and then young people had grown up during the war. They'd become adults over those 6 years, or certainly much older. They had families and lives now in England. Many had served in the armed forces. And in most cases, what was there to go back for? Their families were gone. Not just their families, but their communities, their whole community, their whole way of life, which they'd been born into, was gone, destroyed, smashed. Moreover, any of them who came from Eastern Europe or East Germany would find that there was a new despotism in Eastern Europe after the end of the war. The Russians, the Soviets, had effectively taken over the management of terror and oppression in Eastern Europe from the Germans, and therefore the climate in Eastern Europe was very far from healthy or receptive. So for the most part, they did stay here. Now I have another question. Now somebody just asked me that question. How many went back? And the from Jennifer, and the answer is really, I think, very, very few. Most of the people I've interviewed or I've spoken to who were either previously Kindertransport themselves or families certainly stayed here. They made a life here. They made a life and they became contributors, notable contributors to UK society. So they survived this terrible trauma that they had been through to become meaningful citizens of their new countries. And I think it's heartening, despite the tragedy of the story, that their families still live here and are still now valued members of our own community. I'm just checking for more questions. I don't currently seem to have any questions, but I'm certainly happy to hang around for a while to take any that may arise. I think if there aren't any more questions, and I'll give it another minute, then I'll simply end the video call. Now, of course, if anybody suddenly remembers a question they'd like to ask, then obviously feel free to use email or telephone to contact Gateshead Libraries, and I'm sure they will speedily refer the comment onto me or the question onto me, and I will, of course, immediately supply my best efforts to supply sensible action. Now, here's one from Rosie Serderville. Very excellent question. Long time before Nicholas Winton. Thank you, Rosie. I knew I could depend on you. That's a very good question as to why Nicholas Winton, it took so long for the wonderful work that Nicholas Winton did to be recognized. And I suspect that that may be because his contribution wasn't seen as war work as such. And the whole story of the Kindertransport has sort of unfolded over a period of time. And I think it was genuinely a long while until we, society, realized the contribution made by Winton, of course, and others, and so many others. Winton was if you like, the tip of a humanitarian iceberg. So I'm it's great that he's been recognised. I don't think there's any deliberate reason why he wasn't recognised sooner. I think, but I'm glad certainly that he has been. Now then. Oh, now another question. Do I know if it was hard to find foster families? Now the answer is yes, at times it was, because the government, the UK government, although it was prepared to assist with the programme and prepared to cooperate, being the UK government, wasn't prepared to stump up any cash. So all of the Kindertransport, all the young people, had effectively to be vouched for. And the Refugee Children's Movement, which is funded by Jewish refugee groups and other humanitarian groups and the Quakers, actually had to put up £50, as I think I mentioned, as a surety, if you like, for the child. So in some instances, it was quite difficult to find foster families. And as I think I mentioned, a number of children had to be actually accommodated in camps for a while before they could be fostered. A bit like the refugee children who were sent as refugees from the cities once they started 1940. Now, another question. Now, another question is what kind of people took the children in? I think the answer to that was a pretty mixed bag. The Quaker Church, certainly the Quaker movement, with a strong humanitarian background and connection, was very influential in finding families. And the Refugee Children's Movement and the Jewish relief agencies were often, or certainly would try to place the children with Jewish families, co-religionists. And the Habanim, who were a Jewish youth and Zionist group, were active in providing assistance for the Kindertransport. And as I mentioned, the RCM had hoped that the British government would allow a number of children into Israel, or what became Israel, Palestine, but it wouldn't. The situation there was thought to be too fraught already. And so the people who came forward, I think, were probably those who were likely to be members of a faith community, be it the Jewish faith or the Quakers, or indeed any other faith, really. But I think Jewish and Quakers, non-conformist Church of England generally were probably the main groups of families that came forward. See if we've got any further questions. Yeah. Oh, reading recommendations. Same person's asked for reading recommendation. Excellent. There are a number of books on the Kindertransport. What I'll do, Jason, is I'll provide a list of those, and I'll send them by email to Gateshead Library, my colleagues at Gateshead Library, who will then publish the list. There's quite a number of very good books on the subject, personal survivors and accounts. So yes, leave that one with me. I'll make sure I get a decent list out. And that so far is all of the questions. I feel a bit like an auctioneer if you're all done. Going, gone. I'll hang on for another minute in case there's any further questions before we sign off. I think that appears to be all of the questions. No more coming up. So I'll now wish everyone a very good evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next talk, which won't be very long. I think Rosie is on next week, and she will as ever be very interesting. So thank you very much, and well done to all the staff at Gateshead Library, who I know have laboured mightily behind the scenes to make this work, in spite of dealing with an aging Luddite. So thank you very much, everyone, and good night. Good night.